In today's episode, we are discussing the evolution of probation and are joined by two recently retired chiefs, both of whom served as CPOC President. Our guests shared their wealth of knowledge on how probation as a profession has changed and adapted over the past 2 decades. Hope you enjoy. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Karen.
Today we're joined by Ventura County Chief Probation Officer Mark Varela. Not for long. Maybe by the time this airs, you may be in the retired ranks. And retired Chief Mike Daly from Marin.
Yep.
Gosh, it took me a minute there.
Yeah.
Because I don't think of you from Marin anymore. Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We're going to talk a little bit about probation and kind of the trajectory of the profession. You guys have been in this career for quite some time and have some thoughts, looking back on it. Would love to try to capture that today. So before we do that, let's start with kind of how long you've been in the profession. So, and maybe how did you get into the profession? So we'll start with you, Chief Varela.
Well, I've been doing this for a long time, 34 years. I started in 1988. So literally, I went from graduating college to wandering in the Hall of Administration and applying for a position of Deputy Probation Officer, which I didn't know was open at the time. So a lot of the fate worked into what happened with me. But I was a pre-law major at UC Santa Barbara. My aspirations were to be a criminal defense attorney. I wanted to come back and work in the community that I was raised in. I decided to take a couple years off and take a tour of a variety of law schools. In the meantime, I had a teacher's assistant who was a teacher's assistant for a constitutional law class at UC Santa Barbara who encouraged me to, if I was going to take a couple years off, find a job in criminal justice, work there for a little while and see how you like it. And so I applied to be a deputy probation officer. This was a few weeks after graduation, and I started a couple months later, and 34 years later, that's where I've been. So I've always thought of myself as one of those fortunate people that found a profession that was perfectly suited for me and enjoyed over 3 decades working in the job. So,
well, I'm always surprised when I hear stories like that, except that I always hear stories like that. It seems like a lot of chiefs ended up finding their way, and probably others in probation kind of by accident. And in fact, that's part of why we want to have this podcast, is to make sure people know more about probation, because I think once people do find their way there, they do fall in love with it. I know that's certainly my part of my story as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
So Chief Daly, what brought you to the profession?
I was a social science major at Cal Poly with a criminal justice concentration, and I graduated and I went back to my hometown of Marin, and I knew the treasurer tax collector of Marin at the time. He was like a second father to me, and he got me an interview with the chief probation officer, and I was fortunate, and he actually hired me, and so as an extra hire. And so I was happy about that. And like Mark said, 3 decades blow by, which is just kind of crazy to even contemplate. But I got into it basically because I played a lot of sports when I was growing up, and I just felt giving back to the community, like Mark had mentioned, and being able to coach somebody through life's circumstances and probation is really parallel to teaching somebody how to hit a baseball or shoot a basketball or whatnot. A little bit different, but there's some teaching going on, and I always enjoyed that. So that was the attraction. And like Mark said, 1990 to 2020 for me, and 30 years went by, and the last 11 years as chief. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
That's so wonderful to hear. And it's great because you used a word that we've heard as well in a lot of our conversations, not just on the podcast, but coach. Like, how do you describe what, skill sets that a probation officer tends to need or maybe uses to be successful, and coaching is certainly one that comes up again and again. So that's I love that, both of those stories. And, one of the reasons why we wanted to have both of you on the podcast together, well, there's several. You'll have to wait until the end of the podcast to hear all of them. But one of the reasons is you both served as president of CPOC. I believe, Chief Varela, you were 2015.
2015.
And Chief Daly, you were 2014.
Yes.
So you had to fix all of the things that he messed up in the
Laura
following
had to
year.
keep all the good things going.
Oh, look at that.
Pressure.
Good. Glad to hear that. But it does give you a little bit of a perspective. I think sometimes serving as president, kind of statewide, what's happening in probation. And so, we hope to dive into the conversation today about how the profession has evolved over time, and just in your experience from the time that you maybe entered the profession and to the time as you're retiring or retired from the profession, how you've seen that change. So we'll start with you, Chief Varela.
Well, a lot different in 1988 for sure. So my first assignment was in adult investigations. So at that time, we were responsible for providing the court with these, very detailed pre-sentence reports to help inform the judge on making an appropriate decision at the time of sentencing. Now, I was fresh out of college, and I wasn't too hip on writing term papers, but I was in that groove, so it made for a really good first assignment for me. And it was a fantastic assignment for me. I think it taught me a lot about the technical aspects of the criminal justice system. And a lot of what I did during that initial time not only was learning how to navigate through the penal code, but sitting in court. And we were joking a little earlier, this was pre-computers. So all of our reports were dictated. So they were handwritten on legal pads and then dictated through a dictaphone, and a word processor used to type them up for us. That's how it used to be done back then. At that time, we were writing 15 to 18 page pre-sentence reports. We were known back then as the experts in determinate sentencing. The courts often relied on us to understand, the sentencing, the correct sentencing terms for defendants. That's not quite the case anymore. I think the caseloads have increased quite a bit. Those reports have much more concise than they were back then. But looking at even our work in the community, I had a caseload. My first caseload out in the field was 125 youth. And I often worked by myself. And this was the time before all the training you got was really DPO core. There wasn't a lot of other training that you got in addition to that. So you were often on your own, out in the field, navigating through a variety of problems and helping youth and or adults who were in need of, some type of guidance. And, fast forward to what it looks like now is much more different. We didn't have the use of risk and need assessments. We didn't have the top-notch training that's given to probation officers now. Oftentimes it was, we went by our gut. What did our gut tell us to do? And did your senior or supervisor advise you how to get through a particular issue? So I think it's much more scientific now, much more thorough now. When your gut is aligned with what a evidence-based tool is telling you, then that you're right on in terms of your assessment. But It was often you're working alone, often on the sidelines, and fast forward now, I think we're so much more advanced than we were back then in terms of not only the technical part of the job, but our work with our community-based organizations, our justice partners. I think we're so far ahead of where I started in 1988. And when I often tell those stories to my staff, they think, oh my goodness, I can't believe that you even survived back then. So really proud of the profession and how far we've come.
Yeah, no, that's probably pretty similar to your experience as well,
Yeah.
Chief Daly. What would you add?
When you talked about the changes, I try to break it down into our major responsibilities, which Mark alluded to: providing investigative reports for the court, providing supervision, and running a juvenile hall. Those are like the top three. And I think the supervision of the people we supervise in the community, both juvenile and adults, as well as how the juvenile halls are run, have probably been the most significant changes. The reports have gone up and down in terms of volume, but the supervision and how we administer our juvenile halls is radically different. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah.
But to me, and Mark touched on this, the work of Dr. Ed Latessa in helping us understand what works in probation and what's going to really change behavior. So a person is no longer a public safety risk. That's was really good. And the training, as Mark alluded to, and I think our stature, not only legislatively, but in our community, has really risen over the years. And there's been a couple legislative pieces, particularly in 2009 and 2011, that would bolster that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because I was curious, based on the changes, what you may attribute that to. And so are you referring to 678?
Yes.
I figured you would. And so when I think about those changes, and I was thinking about this, preparing for this discussion, 678 kind of jumped to my consciousness, and I definitely wanted to talk to both of you about that. But why don't you go ahead and start?
I thought Senate Bill 678, it was authored by Mark Leno, I believe 2009, really entrusted our profession to and challenged us to make a significant difference in order to combat what was a state crisis that we didn't have very much to do with. And so they challenged us, and I think we succeeded. I think we wildly succeeded. And I think that got the attention of not only the legislature, but our community and our surrounding criminal justice partners, that we can make a significant difference. And shortly thereafter, again, a state crisis that we didn't have very much to do with, a significant overpopulation of CDCR, we were asked to problem solve that. And there were a lot of doubters back then. And we took on that challenge. We were the chair of our committees, which was basically all the criminal justice departments. And we had to really administer justice in a way, and probation and services in a way that was pretty significant. I don't think there's been a more revolutionary or significant change in criminal justice since the 70s, when they got rid of determinate or indeterminate sentencing. And now we're asking for a radical shift in our responsibilities with realignment. And we took that on, and that significantly elevated our stature in the community, in the field of criminal justice, and certainly with our legislators, who entrusted us with quite a bit of responsibility and money.
Yeah, no, and I was thinking a little bit about how this SB 678 that you're speaking of is about adult supervision for those on probation, and trying to make those changes. And because prior to that, I think you both mentioned the caseloads and how large they were, and it's difficult to do the types of things we know work and change the behavior. So certainly that allowed for that. But one thing that you instituted, an interesting program that I know we talk about a lot, even to this day, the Wall of Change. Is that right? Yeah. And that was, I think you may have started that either just before 678, or were able to expand it under 678. But talk a little bit about, is that one of the examples that you were able to kind of do to make the change that we were needing? Yeah,
and it also, it was a program that celebrated success. So right around the time that, Mark was talking about, the work and the training, the elevated training that we got with folks like Dr. Edward Latessa, in giving us caseloads commensurate with risk level. And when you're able to do work with a caseload of, maybe 40 or 50 high risk folks, you can do a lot more. You can do better work in helping those folks not be a public safety threat anymore. So the Wall of Change program basically was a program that would reward folks for their success in the community. These were folks that were some of our most significant offenders, who had a long criminal history, maybe never employed, poorly educated. You can go on and on with the stuff that they had to deal with, and you turn their life around. And we offered them a lot of programs and services. And when they were doing very, very well, we would honor them, and we'd have a celebration in our Board of Supervisors arena, and all the criminal justice partners would come, including the presiding judge and all the other judges, and they would honor these folks. So it was oftentimes the first time they have succeeded in anything in their life, and they were extremely proud of themselves and their spouses and their parents, and a lot of people would come, and the place was packed. And it was just a different way of recognizing probation, and the community also being involved in that, and obviously all the criminal justice partners, and recognizing that you can be successful. And we did have a pretty good successful completion of probation rate in the county at the time. So we were all proud of that, and that's a program that's continued today by Chief Washington, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah, and it's an example of a small thing. It maybe seems like a small thing, celebrating the success of the change and giving folks an opportunity to be honored for that and uplifted for that. That seems like the types of things that we started to see kind of take hold around the state. At the same time, though, you pointed out that, the supervision, and there's a public safety aspect and accountability aspect. And that's also something that I remember very clearly in both your leadership as a president and just over the years working with you as chief. That never strayed far from the piece of that we really had that balance. And so, can you talk about the accountability and why that's important to also get to some of the successes that you just spoke of?
Yeah, a lot of the evidence-based programming that Mark was speaking to earlier always talked about positive reinforcements, but you have to mix in accountability. There's got to be accountability mixed into this formula somewhere. And there's examples of accountability from a verbal, hey, you can't do that anymore, to all the way up and leading to incarceration. I think probably the most significant piece of accountability that we were helpful in crafting together was the flash incarceration.
Yeah.
And it was immediate, and it was short-term sanctions where you get somebody's attention, and it's a significant way to get their attention. And I think I remember working with my public defender, Jose Varela,
right,
who convinced his public defenders throughout the state that this is actually something that will benefit their clients.
Right.
And so it was and we eventually put that into legislation, but Marin had done it before it was even legislated, and we had agreements with the sheriff and the court and public defender, and it worked. And it was a good example of collaboration and what we were able to do. And it kind of kicked off with 678 and a realignment,
right,
where it all kind of came together. And again, our stature in the community that was recognized by other criminal justice department heads and the courts were saying, yeah, this is working out, and probation is doing a really good job.
Sure.
Because we had our share of people that thought we weren't going to be able to handle realignment at all, and that was proven otherwise.
Yeah, no,
So,
that's a great
but
point.
I thought flash incarceration was probably our best example of
that balance.
It's an accountability.
Yeah.
And again, there's a wide spectrum of holding people accountable, and there's a whole slew of things that you can do prior to incarceration that you can hold somebody accountable.
It seems like the things that you're talking about on the adult side always struck me as an outgrowth of the things that we've also learned on the juvenile side. And so one of the really big changes, and I know is a huge game changer for you and your county and the things that you were really involved with, Chief Varela, which was JDAI, right? I'll probably get this wrong, but is it the Juvenile
Detention Alternatives Initiative?
And so, as was stated, that's, how we are interacting with juveniles and keeping juveniles out of the system is a really important piece to our work. And of course, when they are in the system, making sure that we're doing everything we can while they're in detention to, help them through that part of the process. So, talk a little bit about that, if you will, and the difference it made in kind of the trajectory of how the profession evolved in the juvenile side of the house.
Sure. So that was a new concept when we launched that in Ventura County in 2002. It took a little while for our justice partners to embrace what we were trying to do. Right about that time, we were building a brand new juvenile detention facility that could accommodate 420 youth.
Wow.
And we were working the opposite direction. We're trying to find ways to keep youth out of custody. And so that was real interesting kind of
dynamic. Yes,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what we learned in this process, one of the things that we really strengthened was our data collection and analysis. And when you talked about evolving as a profession, that's one of the areas that we've really involved in technology and our ability to capture data and using that data to tell us a story and drive our decisions moving forward. And what we learned in Ventura County is we got a good idea of the kids who were coming through our doors of juvenile hall. We knew where they were coming from, who was bringing them through the door, why they were coming. And in drilling down, we figured that we would not wait till a youth came through the doors of juvenile hall before we started to at least connect with that youth and family. So that was the drive to start embedding community-based correction programs out in neighborhoods and in areas to address the youth before they would be arrested and come in through the system. So that was the whole focus of JDAI. And over the years, we worked with the Annie Casey Foundation. We worked with the W. Hayward Burns Institute. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that we both have in common. We were both given the Courageous Leadership Award by W. Hayward Burns Institute for our work in JDI. I just remember that right now during this discussion.
That would have been an interesting award ceremony.
Yes. But it was, taking chances and really see if we can embed some really good resources in the community to address a lot of the reasons why youth were coming through our doors. And we've been highly successful in Ventura County. We've launched 3 evening reporting centers. We've created a graduated response matrix that our probation officers use, so that way they understand that the only option isn't a return back to the juvenile detention facility. We worked with our partners, both in the community and our justice partners, to really start look at different ways that we could manage youth without having them come back into our juvenile detention facility. And it's taken a lot of work. We've been doing it for a couple decades.
Yeah.
And,
I was going to say, when did that start? When did JDAI start in Ventura?
Well, it started with us in 2002.
Okay.
And we really used Santa Cruz County and San Francisco County as sort of the programs we wanted to emulate in Ventura County. So we relied, particularly in Santa Cruz, on what they were doing there and see if we can recreate that in Ventura. So real proud of the work in that area. And one of the examples that I want to point out and how far this has come, we actually use probation funding through JJCPA to expand our CEO's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to create a youth equity component. So we're using JJCPA funds to fund a couple positions to look at youth equity issues in the community, look at ways that we can address them, break down some barriers, and that's part of that, forward looking and what we can do as a profession to help in the community to create just better overall wellness. So.
Well, and it's also a good example of what we were wanting to talk about today, right? The evolution of probation and the communities or the counties who started the JDAI, for example, not every county then did exactly JDAI, but we all kind of peer-to-peer learned from some of those successes, right? And then you share with your peers, and those things get adapted to, your own county, and we start to see major change happen throughout the state. And then that builds upon, one step leads to another. It just seems like as we look back now, that's kind of, if it were planned, it sounds like it was a brilliant plan to try to move us from one part of this spectrum to the other. But it really does seem as though probation did a good job in building upon the lessons learned, the successes, and probably some failures along the way to try to continue to improve the profession.
I think a lot of those came out of our quarterly meetings, where we'd all learn from each other. And those are very well-run professional meetings, and you have a lot to take credit for that.
You took the bait. Thank you.
Yeah. But CPOC, we'd learn from each other in different parts of the state, whether it's the politics or the money and the funding to everything. And Mark and I, as president, we'd have to really, when we trying to develop statewide policy, you'd have to really listen to these folks in different regions. And I think that's part of our growth when we talk about the evolution and listening to each other and listening to the needs, because the folks from the northern region have different needs from the Bay region to the southern region, and it's tough to put it all together. And then once we get that organized, then we have to go through the legislative process, and so that was always fun. But
super easy.
But so when you talk about the evolution. And I mean this in all seriousness, Karen, that, CPOC and their stature within Sacramento is really elevated us as well under your leadership and your staff. So that has positioned us nicely over the years. And we've done a lot of good work for the community. I
appreciate hearing that, although it's really not the entire part of the story. It's one of the reasons why we want to talk to the two of you, because it is that president's role, the fact that you guys not only gave so much to your individual counties, which people who worked with you in your counties are probably well aware of, but what your leadership has done for the entire state. And because of the way I think CPOC tends to work, right? The chiefs work with each other. We're one of the latest things that we've been saying a lot, because it just seems to jump right out, is, counties helping counties solve state problems. That's what you guys have always done, just out of human nature, right? You sit in a room, problems are presented to you, you've got to do something. Oftentimes probation is the last resort, the last stop of trying to figure out a problem. And so you rely on your peers to learn from how they might be doing something, and how that could, or pieces of that could work with you. So I think you've had an opportunity to not only see that, but you've both led it, through your careers, certainly as chiefs, and certainly my time being able to work with you. So I would definitely concur with that. One other thing you had said, both of you actually touched on, both in talking about 678, which remember is on the adult side, JDI, which is on the juvenile side, and a lot of change has happened on the juvenile side that we haven't even scratched the surface of. But there seemed to be, I think you both said there was either maybe uncertainty with some of your partners, in the community, that we could do it, or that we should be going in the direction that was kind of being set forth. And yet probation was willing to do that and step up and kind of step to the plate and make it happen. So what do you think why do you think probation does that? It seems like it's happening over and over again. Why are you guys willing to seemingly take on the impossible?
I think it's in our nature to do this, right? I think particularly at the chief level, I think you have some strong leaders that are not afraid to lead, and folks are very comfortable working within their boundaries, within their silos, and I think it's very difficult to take a non-traditional place and lead a change that really nobody knows about. I always felt that when I came back from our CPOC quarterly meetings, like I had the most information about what's happening and particularly with changes in the law, new initiatives, than any of my peers did in the county. So I felt there was a responsibility to make sure that I bring everybody up to speed on what was happening. And, a lot of these new initiatives, probation's taken a leadership position on it. We've literally gone, and I've said this before, during my tenure as chief, I've literally seen our profession go from the sidelines onto the playing field, but not only onto the playing field, but taking a very important role in the team. The quarterback role, in leading a lot of this. So I think it's what we do. It's we lead the change, and I think we're very used to that now. And we've developed a culture, at least within the Chiefs, that if there's something difficult that's going to be coming down the pike, particularly from Sacramento, probation's going to be front and center in making this happen. This is the narrative that I've been pushing in Ventura County. I think all of my colleagues and our policymakers in Ventura know that if there's something major that's going on and it's impacting our system, our justice system, probation's going to be one of the key players in making this happen. And certainly that's been the case at least the last dozen years.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would imagine with as much that you guys need to be connected to, it's really important to have those connections in your communities to try to help surround the various different problems that come our way. It's a complex system, the justice system.
And I think the realignment when we are chairing that group and understanding the mission of all the other folks who are on that committee, from Health and Human Services to Public Defender to District Attorney, Sheriff, Court, and all their needs, are in order to make the folks that we supervise successful. There's been a lot of social change too. And to me, this is almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, they're not going to do well if they don't have a roof over their head or they don't know where their next meal is. And so all of a sudden, probation is in the business of providing funding for what they call sober living arrangements.
Right.
And we used to pay for that. We'd pay for your first 6 months because they're unmotivated to make significant changes in your life when they don't even know where they're going to sleep or where their next meal is coming from. So now all of a sudden probation's in the business of housing and we're in the business of providing food and employment. And so our tasks expanded. And like Mark said, we were kind of the jack of all trades. I mean, when there's a problem, well, probation can probably do this. And I don't want to say the other entities are more linear in scope, but just in my 30 years of experience, we tend to be the
our
collectors.
Mission is broader.
Yeah, it's very broad.
Right.
And so in order for our folks to be successful and no longer public safety threats, we have to position ourselves to provide them with some services that are outside the normal scope. And that's where I think some of these folks like recovery coaches and previously criminal justice folks that were inside our criminal justice system and now work for some of us have provided a great tool for us to advance some of those things like housing, signing people up for SSI, food stamp, all the stuff that probation officers, I'd get lost in one of those buildings. I wouldn't be very useful. But some of these folks who are recovery coaches, I know one in particular who's now working for Alameda County Probation Department, and as a matter of fact, got a CPOC award.
We tend to find good people to try to thank them for their service, and it does bring to mind like the folks who really are carrying out a lot of the things that once you became chief and you saw some of the issues and initiatives that had to be kind of led. The folks that work in probation. I mean, how do you motivate them to constantly be in this evolution of hey, maybe we need to do things different. Maybe we need to do more. How do we talk a little bit about your role in dealing with your staff?
Mark and I spoke about this earlier, and we kind of shared the same philosophy. I always came back from CPOC really excited. My staff was going, "Oh my God, here he comes! What harebrained idea does he have next?" But
that makes it sound like CPOC came with harebrained ideas.
No, it was cutting edge, quite frankly, and we had the latest and greatest in information. And as president, we were in on some calls, executive level calls, that we knew what was coming down the pike. And Mark and I shared the same philosophy of give that out to your staff and let them know what's coming. Right. The train coming down, and sometimes the train was big and scary and loud, but we knew it was coming, and there was no way around it. So how are we going to make this new legislative rule fit for us, and how are we going to design it in Marin to make it fit for us so we're comfortable with this?
Yeah,
because each, and I was just thinking in my mind the significant changes in juvenile hall and how it's administered. And the more you tell your staff what's coming down, it's going to start January 1st, then the more time we have to prep for it. And then there's been numerous occasions over the years where that had happened. But Mark and I shared the same philosophy of get it to your staff so they know it's coming. You don't want to upend them and say, guess what? And so that's always been our philosophy together, is get it out. Yeah, because they're going to come up with great ideas to help you with it. You can't do everything.
Yeah, right. We have to rely on the very capable, well-trained, as you pointed out, and obviously people who are drawn to this profession wanting to help make these things work. So that's, and that's part of the reason why we want the podcast out there, is we want to be sure that folks are hearing about how these things do come about and what goes into it, maybe what's happened before. So how kind of taking this journey on how we have evolved has been really interesting for me to prepare for. I hope you guys have kind of found it interesting to talk through. But as we get close to the end of the conversation, I'm curious, because I'm sure there's plenty that I haven't hit on, but in thinking about today, is there anything that I haven't asked that you thought would be interesting to add to the conversation?
I want to talk a little bit about something that Chief Daly mentioned, and that's...
It's Mike now.
Oh, Mike, sorry. Mike was about the behavioral change. I think a lot of our staff would draw a lot of our probation officers to the profession is this desire, this willingness to want to change lives and make a big difference. And as chief, you get the opportunity of receiving some cool letters from clients who have worked with your staff. And I'm going to use this as an example because it's something that I dealt with this past week. I received a letter from an AB 109 client, so very high risk, and talking about his probation officer and how his probation officer, he didn't know what to expect at first, but how his probation officer was really, really instrumental in him eventually getting off community, supervision and landing a job that paid $37 an hour. Oh, wow. And he talked about how his probation officer was very encouraging and supportive and held him accountable when he needed to be held accountable, but never gave up on him, even though he was willing to give up on himself. Mm. And so in reading these letters, that's really what we do, right? It's the nuts and bolts of what we do. And we recently went through a strategic planning process. Our vision statement in Ventura County is transforming and empowering lives for a stronger community. And I do believe, and this plan came with input at all levels of our agency, I do believe that is what our folks want to do. They want to transform lives. They want to make a difference. They want to change the trajectory of someone's life and get them down a path of success. And that's very, very important. And that's at the core of why our folks choose this profession. And it's really cool as a chief to be able to sit back and see that happening. Going to a reentry program graduation and hearing from the participants how much of an impact the probation officer has played in their graduation. It's powerful. And I think it really motivates our folks to continue pushing and continue going. So it's been really, from my vantage point, something that's really, really cool from being a chief and being able to see that. So it's that transformative work that really is something that has evolved, and our folks are so good and so resourceful at getting people on that right track. So
it strikes me as you're talking that it really comes down to, if we can get our folks tools, they will help change our communities. And that's one of the things that I think chiefs have always, that's the top of the list. It's the top of our legislative list. It's the top of the things that we talk about, all the time, right? Is that we have to, get tools to our people, because they will be resourceful. They will adapt. They will find what it's going to take to make these changes happen, which often require this balancing act of the accountability and finding new ways to get people opportunities. And so it definitely is a theme that keeps coming through some of these conversations that we've been having.
Yeah. And you'd hear a lot of those at the Wall of Change ceremony, thanking their probation officer, thanking the judge, thanking the recovery coaches. The recovery coaches, I think, this started off as an idea in Marin back in 2010, I believe, where we utilized folks in a community to help us out with the trust issues in the community in order to work with some folks. And it ended up really blossoming, and I would really advocate for that. The gentleman I was talking about, who I befriended, he served 19 years in state prison, and he was able to be resentenced under a rather obscure law, and he was released based on all of his achievements while in prison. And he now works for Alameda County Probation Department. His name is Joe Mason, and he does incredible work. And it's sometimes that person, that go-between that can assist us, anything that we can utilize to make the community safe, or to reach some other people who have shared life experiences. And somebody who's been down for 19 years, I mean, that carries a lot of weight. The other thing you talk about legislatively, and my hope, and I know we always had this in mind, Karen, was just an attention towards victims, and always keeping victims of crime in mind relative to some of the things that are going on right now, and always have been going on. I've always been a real strong advocate of victim rights and restorative justice programs.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And those you have seen flourish over the last couple of decades, and certainly something that we cannot lose sight of. And at times, I think in all fairness, it has, and that's not, one isn't at the opposite of the other, trying to help restore victims at the same time that you're trying to make change, meaningful change for those who are serving on your caseloads, seem like both can be done together, and that has to happen. The
speed of Sacramento, the speed of the game, as they say, is
true,
pretty fast. So I can appreciate. I was just putting in my little 2 cents for always.
Exactly, that's what you're here for. Well, actually, I'm surprised that you guys managed to go through this entire time here. I may have had to get you here under false pretenses. I think both of you thought that we were here to really have the final debate as to who is better, Giants or Dodgers, because this has been the debate that has been at our table between these two guests for ever, as long as I've known the two of you. So you may have thought this was going to be a sports show. I may, had wished Santa gave me a podcast about a sports show. That's not what this is, but I'll give you a few minutes to have that out. Who won the last bet?
I think I won the last bet. He stopped betting me.
we both came on Chief right around within 6 months of each other. And I got 3 World Series, and he's got 1 with an asterisk. So.
Oh, an asterisk. Oh, no.
And you got cheated out of 1, too. Sorry. No, it's all good. I love Mark, and we're always texting back and forth. It makes the baseball season full.
And if I tell him that the Dodgers have won 10 years straight, our division 10 years in a row, that still won't compare to the World Series rings. But I think both of us right now are a little bit more worried about the Padres this coming season. So we might have to join forces to keep our friends to the south down.
There's other Chiefs we can needle.
There you go.
Dodger fans too.
As you can see, it's, you got to have some way to blow off a little bit of steam. This has definitely been the one for the two of you. We really appreciate you, though, sharing really illustrious careers sitting before me here, and wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about it with you, kind of looking at it in the rearview mirror, and which is probably a nice, why you seem so relaxed, you soon will be, and I'll remain jealous for a little longer. It's been a pleasure, not only today, but to be able to work with you and call you both friends. So thank you for making the trip to Sacramento to have this discussion today.
Thank you for having us.
Yep.